up the did we set up the dates for spring, Kate?
We did, and
We did.
I'll
Okay.
share them with folks after this
Okay.
this webinar.
Great. Great.
So we're at 12:01, just so we can get the full hour. We're going to get started. My name is Kate Matthews-Bray. I'm the Director of Alumni Engagement here at NJIT. Thank you for joining us for the third and final session of the Highlander Alumni Personal Growth Series. I'm excited to welcome you to this afternoon's session, which focuses on acknowledging your perception to appreciate perspective. Before we jump in, I just want to share some details on how tonight's gonna, or how this evening, or this afternoon, sorry, it's the webinar, is going to work. When you entered, your mic was muted, and we kindly ask that you please keep your microphone muted during the presentation. We want this session to be interactive, and there will be times when you'll have a chance to ask questions or share comments, and we'll let you know when those happen. You're welcome to either keep your video camera on or off. It's whatever you're most comfortable. And please feel free to type in questions or comments in the chat box throughout the session. We'll take some time in the end to address them. And lastly, this session is recorded and will be available on demand on YouTube. It is now my absolute pleasure to introduce our presenter, Dr. Michael Edmondson.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, my friend. Thank you, everyone, for showing up today so close to Christmas. This was a last minute change. I think the initial date was December, was last week sometime, and scheduling got in the way as it often does. So thank you. Really looking forward to this one. My PhD's in history. So when we talk about perspective, it's like so near and dear to my heart. So just a note on skills, and hopefully you can see my screen. If you can't, please let me know. So, and then you can, chat away in the chat, and Kate monitors the chat, and I'll give you a link to this presentation at the end. I'll give you my email address. So, generally speaking, there's hard skills and soft skills. And I need to move my, I need to be able to shrink the menu for Zoom. And hard skills are things like, learning a second language, database management, software usage, software programming. And soft skills are a lot of the things that we rely on, our interpersonal and intrapersonal skills like integrity, communication, teamwork, problem solving, critical thinking, and so forth. They're generally the two main classifications of skills. I've been arguing for the last few years that there's really a third set of skills called essential skills. And these are skills that link the personal and the professional. They link the hard and the soft. And it's the subject of my 9th book that's coming out in the spring, Achieving Productivity, 24 Essential Skills for High-Performing Teams. And these are the 24 skills. Now, each one, you could talk ad nauseum about each one. For today, for this hour, webinar, really just looking at one component of one of the essential skills, challenge your assumptions to think differently. That's really all we're focused in on. This could be an 8-hour webinar. It's not. It could be a 2-day workshop if you wanted it to. There's so much material for each of these. But these 24 essential skills aren't going to be found in soft skills or hard skills. So just as a FYI to you, we're really talking about, one small component of one of the 24 essential skills. I want to make sure that I am absolutely clear, and hopefully I will say this repeatedly. What I'm about to, and I again generally don't tell you what to do if you've heard me talk before. I just pose a lot of questions. I'm not a big fan of people telling others what to do. We need to start off with the premise, though, that what we're about to talk about and the questions I'm going to give you and the thoughts you might process are going to require you to work hard at hard work. Like, you're not going to get really so much better with perspective and perception in this hour. What you'll get is grounded in some, solid information and have a basis of understanding where then you can start to work hard at the hard work on your own. And I really like a therapist point of view where a therapist will often say, look, you see me an hour a week. You're doing most of the work the rest of the week. We're only here an hour a week. And it always hits home. It's a good reminder of, yep, I can expose you to some things, but ultimately you have to make the decision to work hard at the hard work. So this is all about self-awareness. I'm a big fan of especially the older you get, it's very important to maintain a high degree of self-awareness. I always recommend people have pen and paper, ask questions in the chat. Some of the topics may be uncomfortable. We only grow when we're uncomfortable. So just an FYI that we're here really to increase, our self-awareness. So let's introduce, this concept. If your mother tells you she loves you, check it out. So when I was a young lad, many decades ago, the older you get, you speak in decades, so that's a little bit disconcerting. So in my undergraduate days, my mentor was Dr. Jolyon Gerard, Vietnam vet, brilliant historian. And in every class, we would talk about this concept. If your mother tells you she loves you, check it out. And at first, I really didn't understand. But then as we talked about the many perspectives and perceptions that humans have about any one particular person or event, it made a lot of sense to me. And so, I would often tell my mother that she passed 2 years ago. So we would always have a good laugh of like, I don't know, Mom, you tell me you love me. I got, according to my friend, Dr. Gerard, I have to check this out. And she would hit me because she's a little Italian lady. So we always had a good laugh. But it really does, it's kind of MO to life. And so what I tell people is I really don't believe anything you say until you show me. That's nice. You're going to connect me to someone. Okay. And what does that mean? Right. So the words don't really mean a lot to me because I've spent so many years being trained as an historian. It's like, what are the actions? So that's what this is all about. And if you work for me, you get a quick understanding of, you don't really say anything. A, ask them questions, but B, just show them that you're doing something. At the end of the day, that's how I can check it out, right? That's how I can check it out. And so my perception of things is really driven by this operating paradigm. If you tell me something, I'm going to have to check it out. And I'll probably get it confirmed by 2 or 3 other people because that's just how I'm built. And for me, it's a good life approach. Not everyone wants that, right? So let's talk about the complexity of perspective here, right? That was just kind of an opening brain teaser, if you will, icebreaker. If your mother tells you she loves you, check it out. What we're going to now do is take a look at the proverbial glass of water. And I hope that if there's anything you walk away with in this hour, it is the fact that there are not 2 sides to every story. Stop saying that. It's an immature approach to life. If there are 10 people involved in an event, there are 10 perspectives of that event. Now, might you group them together? Sure. And at the end of the day, maybe there's 6 or 7 general perspectives, but don't ever say there's 2 sides to every story. I hear that. I hear someone use that in not in a bar type setting, but in like a legit professional setting. I'm like, they have no idea what they're talking about when it comes to perspective. No clue. There are not 2 sides. There are multiple perspectives to anything. I think in the West, we have done a really good job of bastardizing everything to make it easy for us because we've grown inherently lazy in everything that we think and do. But that's just my footnote in all this. I hope that this slide at least starts you thinking, oh my goodness, there really aren't 2 sides to everything. And in this example, there's 9. You often hear, right, the optimist will tell you it's half full, the pessimist is half empty. Now let's go through 7 other interpretations of what water in a glass could mean. A realist will tell you, well, it is a glass of water. Physicist will tell you there's gas on top and liquid on the bottom. A surrealist would tell you, well, if you lay the glass down, right, and it's on one bottom, it's on the bottom and gas is on the top. A relativist would say it's half empty and half full. And then finally, the utopist will tell you, well, isn't the water uh, couldn't it be on the top if we turned it upside down and put it on the table? The skepticist would say, well, I don't know if this is water. And an artist, this is my favorite one, says, oh, yeah, that's water. I can clean my brush. So when we're talking about a perspective, you need to stop and say, well, wait a minute, how many other perspectives are there to this thing? Like I know at work, I mean, I'm an associate provost. So if and I'll talk to Kate, for example, about a situation with, alumni. All right, Kate's got one perspective. I may go to the provost for his perspective, may go to someone else for another perspective. And then I start to piece together, oh, this is it. This is what I'm understanding now. And I do that all the time, and I feel better informed of the situation, right? You don't ever want to go to one person because you're just limiting yourself to the potential information that's out there, right? So the complexity of perspective exercise is very, very important to just remember as you go through, life. So we're going to revisit this Alan Watts quote at the end, but I wanted to plant the seed right now. The whole process of nature is one of immense complexity. It is impossible to tell if anything is good or bad because you never know the consequences of bad fortune. Likewise, you can never know the consequences of good fortune. And that usually hurts people's heads the first time they read it. And they're like, huh? In short, you don't know if anything that happens to you is good or bad because you don't know the consequences of that event. So, and we're going to look at that. We will look at this closely here. So let's start with a definition. We're going to start off with perception versus perspective. They are critically different, and it's important to understand the difference. For perception, the word perception comes from Latin, as so many of our words do, right? Meaning a taking or receiving. That's important. And it's generally related to the sensing or understanding of something. It's really tied to your emotions. You're perceiving something based on your life situation, right? Your perception of whatever it is. And I always give the example of like when my dad died 9 years ago, and then my mom 2 years ago. And when I was really struggling with the loss of my mother and then being an orphan and, was really struggling with it. And I was reading way too much, probably an unhealthy amount, and, watching too many videos about the death of a parent. And it didn't help my depression, that's for sure. And someone had said, oh, the death of a parent is like when a mirror breaks into 1,000 pieces and you spend the rest of your life picking up the pieces. And I was like, oh yes, that's where I'm at. And then after a while, I started therapy, it helped me process mom's passing. And I told the therapist that, and right away, like he was so smart. He didn't even know me. But he was so smart. And he's like, well, that's one way of looking at it. And I just like stopped and was like, oh my God, Michael, you talk about perspective all the time and you're completely lost yourself here. Like you lost perspective. You lost, your mom died. It completely destroyed your ability to have a different perspective. And like, the therapist was like very, very helpful. And I was like, oh my God, that's right. That's just one perspective. There's another perspective here. And so it was like my perception drove my perspective, right? I felt my emotion was that this is the worst thing that could have happened. Therefore, my perspective was, all right, I'm going to spend the rest of my life picking up pieces of broken glass. And that was not the right perspective. It is not a healthy perspective. So let's look at perspective. So it means science of optics, which I really like from the Latin perspectiva. And this is really taking a look at viewpoint or outlook. So perception is sensing, emotion, perspective is view or outlook, right? And so in a more simplified manner, perception is how individuals interpret and make sense of sensory information or experiences. That's why your past and how you manage your past is so important, because the past can't be changed. But if you haven't managed your past correctly, in a healthy way, then they're going to impact your perception of every event moving forward, right? And another way of looking at this is how people understand and interpret what they see, hear, touch, taste, and smell. Again, based on your experiences, your perception is personal and unique to you. No one can change it. For a perspective, a person's particular attitude or way of viewing something, right? How someone understands a situation, a viewpoint based on beliefs and experiences. Perspective often shapes how you interpret information and make decisions. And generally, always go to Pearl Harbor here, right? And we all know Pearl Harbor, the 7th, 1941, the day that will live in infamy. I don't think anyone on this call was at Pearl Harbor. I only think there's a handful of people alive that were still there, right? So if you were at Pearl Harbor and survived, or knew someone that survived, your perception of that is like really ingrained in the deep emotional tragedy of the day. My perception of Pearl Harbor is really shaped from my knowledge of history, as most of ours would be. Now, if you study history, one of the words, and only historians really know this word, is something called historiography. Historiography is the history of an event. So, in other words, how did historians write about Pearl Harbor in the late 1940s, 1950s? How did the next generation of historians write about it in the late 50s, early 60s? How did the generation of historians writing during the Vietnam War, how did they write about Pearl Harbor? And then in the 80s, you have the Cold War, right? And so on and so forth. And here we are we 1941? So we're 80 years removed from Pearl Harbor. So an historian writing today about Pearl Harbor has a wildly different perspective, right, than someone that wrote about Pearl Harbor in 1952, right? And so when you get a PhD in history, you study the historiography of an event, or you contribute knowledge to the historiography of an event. So you're contributing to the story of the story of the story from one generation of historians to the next. So you have to go and read all these books and understand. Your PhD is really just understanding all these perspectives. How did they get their perspectives? What resources did they use? Were they verified? Did they check them out? And how did they compare to other perspectives? So a PhD in history is wildly useful for understanding this at like the highest degree. And I hope that makes sense. And again, if it doesn't, please, we could talk about it at the end. So in essence, perception's about how we interpret our sensory experiences, while perspective is about the viewpoint or stance we take in understanding the situation or problem. And that's really where we're going now is, okay, I know what perception is about, my emotional response, if you will. Perspective is how I'm looking at something. Now, remember, the essential skill that we're focused in on here is thinking differently, challenge your own assumptions. The easiest person to fool is yourself. I remind myself of that of every day, and I've got a really good team at NJIT, and I just go up to them and say, okay, what don't I know? Tell me something I don't know about this. What am I missing? Right? And they have to be comfortable pushing back against me. So let's look at an example here. These are a couple different examples. So a perception is you see a dog barking and perceive it as aggressive because you had bad experiences with dogs in your past. That's my mom. My mom, was almost bitten by a German Shepherd when she was a little girl in Philly, and never had a good relationship with dogs. I got married and we started having dogs, and I had to help her understand. First of all, I had to respect her perception. Number one, you have to respect everyone's perception. Just rule of thumb. You have to respect their perception. And then I had to help her understand how to change her perspective, right? I didn't so perception versus perspective here. Someone who loves dogs might view the barking as excitement rather than aggression. And over time, mom changed her perspective of dogs because we had little dogs and she grew to appreciate them. But I had to start from the point of, I understand your perception. I'm sorry that happened to you. Uh, A, I'm your son. B, this is a little dog. This dog will not be a threat to you. So we talked it out, and over time she changed her perspective. And that's big when someone can change their perspective on anything. It's very big. So we have two dogs. Gracie's a little Shih Tzu, an appropriate name for Shih Tzus. And we have a rescue, Spencer. Spencer had a horrible first year and a half. I won't detail his early upbringing. It's just too sad and heartbreaking. But he has become the most loving dog in the world. Oh my God, he is just so loving. And when we first brought him home, like, we had never had a rescue before. I didn't know anything about rescues, so I hired a dog trainer. I'm like, I don't understand rescues. Tell me what I don't know that I don't know, right? And so, because my perspective of rescues was really just ill-informed, and I knew that. My perspective was, oh my God, he had a terrible 1.5 years of life, and I want to give him like a loving, caring environment. But my perspective like was all whacked. It wasn't from anything. It wasn't grounded in any way. And the dog trainer came just a couple times, and pretty quickly she said, "Oh, he's not aggressive at all. Spencer's just scared." And I was like, oh my God, my perspective of those two words is now really finely tuned. I thought he was aggressive, and he's not. I'm looking at him through a different set of eyes. And the poor thing is just scared. He was scared of ceiling fans. He was scared of umbrellas. He was scared of a leash. God knows what they did to this poor dog. And so the dog trainer really helped me change my perspective of Spencer and generally rescue dogs, in general. So I thought that was, I think, very important. So perception versus perspective. Let's take a look at a few others. You hear a loud noise and perceive it as a potential threat because you lived in a quiet area your entire life. Like I'm from Philly. I grew up in Philly, go to Philly all the time. I know North Jersey, everyone calls the city New York City. We call the city, I'm down in South Jersey, we call the city Philly. But if you have never stayed in an urban environment, your perception is, oh my God, there's crime everywhere, and your life is under constant, threat. I actually enjoy loud noises. That's how I go to sleep. I like hustle and bustle. I like really diverse sounds and smells and people. So I'm very attracted to urban life, but I understand the perception that some might not like it at all. Right. But again, important for you to understand perception, right? A lot of people don't like to drive in the rain, and they see it as bad weather, but a farmer's going to look at the rain and is like, thank goodness we have rain. We had a 40-day drought here in Jersey. 40 days it didn't rain. And everyone was like, man, we really need rain. Right. We do need it because we went for over a month without rain. So again, perception versus perspective. I also added in here Netflix. It's the only business example in this entire presentation. There are many others to give. Netflix changed its perspective of its marketplace to grow. So not only do people have to change their perspective, but so do businesses if they want to remain sustainable. So this is the Netflix logo from 97 to the present. And I just have a very simple timeline for you. Right? Netflix started offering subscription-based DVD by email services in 1999. And I remember this. I remember you would tell them what you wanted. You'd get a DVD in the mail. You send it back. You'd get the next one in your queue. 8 years later, because they're aware of how the world is changing, they launch their streaming services because they realize, oh, people don't want this DVD nonsense anymore. Right? They want streaming services. People are getting cable, and you can do this now very easily on mobile devices. And in 2013, so what, 6 years later, they see another change in the world and how it operates, and they create their own content. Now, imagine if they didn't change their perspective and Netflix just still today offered DVDs by mail. Well, let's face it, they wouldn't be in business, right? And what's really interesting, this is the number of subscribers that they have year over year. And now they're over 250 million. And the hypothesis we can draw is that they never would have continued on this upward trajectory if they didn't change the perspective of how the world was operating, right? And it's a really good example. We know plenty of stores that did not make an adjustment. They didn't change their perspective. Plenty of businesses. Where's Kodak? Remember Kodak? Yeah, everybody remembers Kodak. In Philly, we had Tower Records. I think in New York, you probably had Tower Records. That doesn't exist anymore, right? So there's all these companies and stores that just don't exist because they didn't change their perspective of the world around them. And honestly, we're seeing this right now with AI in education, AI in business. We don't have time to get into that, but then we're at another inflection point where we have to change our perspective of how the world is operating, and those who don't are just going to be left behind. So a few of the dynamics of perception and perspective to keep in mind, right? These are just a few of the many. Everyone is trapped in their own perception, not thinking about anyone else's perspective, right? We fall prey to this every single day of our lives. So now I'm going to give you some questions. How often do you think about someone else's perspective? That's just a simple, straightforward question. And if you're managing people, I would say, how often do you go up to them and say, hey, what's your perspective of this? And create a culture of openness where they're allowed to, push back a little bit or give a different perspective other than the bosses. Like I really encourage that on my team. It's like, well, push back against me. I mean, you're not going to get fired if you have an idea that's different than the bosses. But let's face it, we know there are certain bosses, no one on this call, of course, we know there are certain bosses that don't create that culture and do fire people if someone on their team has a different thought. And then additionally, is it different at the office compared to in your personal life? So if you're with a partner or if you have a child or an aunt, uncle, parent, whatever, how often do you ask them about their perspective of something? Like that's like, again, we are humans. We can communicate on a scale of the other animals do communicate, but we can communicate at a scale that's wildly different than others. And we actually just don't do these exercises a whole lot because it's too hard. So second thing to remember, there's no real advantage over others if you rely on your perception of things, because that's what everyone else does too. Remember, everyone's life experiences are unique, right? And so it's relying on my perception doesn't really help anything. It's a disconnect from the reality that others experience, right? So how often do you find yourself relying solely on your perception of life events that they happen to you? Again, my mom, she threatened by a dog. Imagine if she went around telling everyone dogs are no good because one almost bit me when I was a little girl. Okay, that's her perception based on her life experiences. Perception is tied to emotion. And then you have to ask yourself, well, why are you solely relying on that? Now, a lot of times I know why, because there are people that go down the road of why me? Oh, why me? Why me? I'm the only one. Yes, out of 8 billion people in the world that are alive today, 8 billion, and the billions others that have come before us, you're the only one that has had this experience. That's correct. And when you say it out loud like that, you start to realize that's probably not a healthy way of processing this, right? Because you do know other people have had some kind of similar experience. But then if you have an understanding of your perception, then maybe you can change your perspective, right? This is very true when you're doing historical research. People believe to be true what they want to be true and stop there. Most people don't spend time investigating their own beliefs. Most people don't challenge their own assumptions, right? It's a cognitive bias. It's like, no, I have all the information I need. No, you have all the information that you need for you to believe that it's true, but I have 18 volumes of information here that demonstrates information counter to what you believe. You just choose not to see it, right? And it's like when people say, "Oh, I only watch, this news network because they tell me the truth." No, go watch 6 different news networks, and better yet, go to Le Monde in France, go to the Globe in Great Britain, or just go read papers from around the world. Well, now there's no newspapers, but go read websites from around the world and other news agencies if you really want a different perspective of the United States. And some people are like, "No, I only watch, whatever channel." Oh, okay. I mean, whatever, you do what you want, but you're not getting a real broad perspective. You're just getting one, right? So in the 1927 Scopes monkey trial, where we talked about using teaching religion in school, this quote came up, and just like one of the best things ever, you know. And William Jennings Bryan was asked, "How often do you think about the things that you do think about?" And then, you read that and you're like, "Oh, geez, I never think about the things that I think about." Right, right. You don't think about the things you think about because you've convinced yourself you know it, right? So then I beg the question, like, why do you not spend enough time investigating your own beliefs? And I kind of like, I'll write stuff out on a whiteboard and I'll look at it, or I'll say things out loud, sometimes to my dogs, because I don't want anyone to hear what I'm thinking. And I'm like, that doesn't even sound right. I haven't thought this through yet. Like, have you ever said to someone, "Hey, have you thought this through?" Maybe. Have you said to yourself, "Probably haven't thought this through yet." Right? I think that's important to understand too. It's very important. Many people are quick to question someone else's beliefs. Oh, we love to judge. Oh my goodness, if there's one thing humans are really good at, it's judging. Investigating one's own beliefs is not typical behavior. Now, why would we? Next question. How often do you find yourself questioning or judging the perspective of others without first learning why they think in the manner in which they do? Like, I teach oral presentation at Tuesday nights to undergrads at NJIT. And, they're not allowed to use any technology. It's 2.5 hours. They listen to each other talk for 2.5 hours. And everyone has to present. And then the students critique each other after the presentation. And at the end of each semester, generally one of the findings is, wow, we never realized how hard listening is. Right, because you don't listen. We listen to respond. We don't listen to hear. And so I train my students, when someone's talking to you, don't respond. Let them finish and then ask a question. Then let them respond to that and ask another question, and do that 3 times. And then you can respond. But sometimes, like, we just have to say what's at the tip of our tongue, otherwise our heads are going to blow off, right? And it's like, no, you're doing a terrible job of listening. 2 ears, one mouth for a reason, right? And so it's very interesting to see the students squirm and struggle listening to each other for 2.5 hours without a phone attached at their finger. No, put it away. Put everything away, because you have to learn to listen. Learning to listen is a skill that's just completely gone by the wayside. So you cannot ask someone to change their perception. You can't do that. As I said earlier, it's based on your life experiences, only their perspective. Doing so is going to lead to arguments. Instead of trying to change someone's perception, help them understand your perspective and try to understand their perspective. Again, perception is related to sensories, emotions based on your life. right? The proper way to do it is I understand your perception. I respect your perspective. Would you allow me an opportunity to give you my perspective as well? And then Susie's perspective is even different than mine. Oh, okay. Let's have a conversation about how our three different perspectives have some common ground and differ. That's a mature conversation. It also seldom happens today. So just going to go over some strategies. I'm going to go through these quickly. We could go over 20 of these things and go through a lot. So how do you discuss a perspective then? Like, how do you do this? So let me help you out. Number one, this is my favorite pie chart of all time. I don't know if I've used it in any other presentations for the alumni. Maybe I have, I'm not sure. It is my favorite pie chart called the knowledge pie chart. The smallest part of the knowledge pie chart is the section of what we know that we know. We know what we know. I know my dog's got to get fed a certain time every day. I know that. What we know, we don't know. I know my oil needs to be changed in my car, but I don't have a clue as to how to change it. My mechanic literally is across the street from where I live. I just take it over there, and those guys are great. What we don't know that we don't know. And this is what hurts a lot of people. What I don't know, I don't know. Right. That's right. You don't know what you don't know. Now, you talk to some people, of course, no one on this call, of course, no one on this webinar. Sometimes their biggest piece of their knowledge probably is the yellow part. They know everything about everything. That's very impressive. I'm very impressed of people that know everything about everything. I don't. In fact, I say I don't know more than I know. Because I'm quite comfortable saying, I don't know. Let's go figure it out. Right. And if you can find a work environment where I don't know is wildly acceptable, I think you're going to find a pretty savvy culture that is focused on progress. I walk around to my team all the time. Well, what do I know that I don't know? But did you know this? Nope. Tell me about it. Okay, great. Thank you. Right. But again, some people in management positions, they feel as though that's a sign of weakness. And okay, whatever. I mean, that's how they want to manage. Number two, you can change and discuss perspectives if you remain open-minded. Remember, your mind's like a parachute. It's not going to work unless it's opened. And, again, the older you get, sometimes that is a little bit more difficult to do. But you work on it. Be curious. I think be curious, not judgmental, is one of the easiest things to do. Just ask questions. Just ask. Don't say anything. Don't judge. What are you judging? Just ask questions. Oh, that's interesting. Why do you think like that? I always tell the story, and it's a tale. I don't know how true this is, but the apocryphal tale. There's a family gathering, and the mom is making a different dish each time. It doesn't really, when you hear it, is making a meatloaf. And the daughter comes in and says, Mom, why did you, cut off the ends of the meatloaf? And she said, I don't know. I should call grandma because grandma's not here yet. So mom calls grandma and says, Mom, why did you cut the ends off of the meatloaf when, you made this for when we were kids? And grandma's like, I'm not really sure. Great grandma was still alive, 94 and kicking. And so grandma calls great grandma and says, Hey mom, why did you cut off the ends of the meatloaf, when making this when we were kids? And great grandma said, Oh, because when we first made meatloaf, we had a pot and it wasn't big enough for the meatloaf that I made. So I just cut the ends off and I've just been doing it ever since. And then you started doing it and you passed it on to, our granddaughter. And it's just fascinating because if you're not curious, you're just judging. Well, that's dumb. What idiot cuts off the ends of the meatloaf? But if you change your perspective and just became curious, you actually find an interesting story as to why the mom did that, right? And so curiosity allows you so many more opportunities in life than judging ever does. Judging is such a turnoff. It's so unattractive. Adapt, be willing to adapt. We live in an age of AI. My goodness, I'm giving talks on AI these days, and it's funny to see people that are just struggling to adapt at a personal level, at a professional level. In the age of AI, business models have to change, teaching has to change, curriculum's got to change. There's a whole world of struggle out there. But if you want to discuss perspectives, and that's what an AI discussion is all about, you got to be able to adapt, to the life situation. Have empathy. Again, this is related to judging people. Where's the empathy? Have an understanding that the person you're talking to is going through a struggle you know nothing about. I mean, Gallup released its, you guys know Gallup, the polling company. They released data back in November. And they said, 50% of employees are thriving. 50%. And they had this line graph they have it tracked over the last decade or so. Which means that the other 50% are either struggling or suffering. So when I walk in a room, I keep that statistic now in the back of my mind. This just came out a few weeks ago in early November. So if there's 10 people in the room, my working assumption is that 5 are doing pretty good and the other 5 are struggling or suffering. Now, I don't know who's what. I just work off of that. And that reminds me that everyone is human and everyone is going through something that I don't know anything about. So have empathy. It's helpful. Have health self-awareness, talking about that, obviously through this webinar. If you're attending this webinar, you're dedicated to self-awareness, so kudos to you. A lot of people aren't taking the time or effort to engage in self-awareness, but you are, so that's a big plus. Commit to lifelong learning. My goodness, you learn so much more out of school than you ever do in school. Who was it, Mark Twain, that said, I never let school get in the way of my education? I mean, I just love that. It's just hysterical when you think about it. You learn way more when you're out of school than you do when you're in. Humility, I think remaining humble when you're talking about perspectives. Again, giving you the etymology of the word Latin, humilis meaning low or grounded, someone who figuratively stays close to the ground, emphasizing modesty and a lack of arrogance. There's no need to pummel your perspective over someone else's head. I mean, I guess you can, you have the freedom to do it, but hopefully you're more self-aware and you catch yourself and you realize, oh, I don't really need to share my perspective right now. The other person needs to give me theirs. Oh, just let them talk. I had a meeting earlier today. I think I spoke for a minute. It's so funny because someone else called me right afterwards and said, wow, that person didn't let us talk. I'm like, nope. So I just let them talk. And that's okay. That's okay. Right? I didn't have to pummel anyone with my perspective. It wasn't important. Right? And so remain humble. If someone's got to let you know their perspective, okay, let them do it. Pause and reflect. Every Saturday night at midnight, my students have to do a reflection of their previous Tuesday night's presentation. And at the end of the semester, the students usually say, wow, I never engaged in that kind of self-awareness, never completed reflections like that on a weekly basis. I really have a better understanding of who I am now as a speaker. I'm like, right, now apply that to other aspects of your life. And finally, respect authenticity. Not everyone's going to have your perspective. They certainly don't have your perception. So let them be them. Again, micromanagers can't do that. They reject authenticity. They want everyone to think the same way. All right, then that's not a healthy culture. Then you got to figure out, like, all right, well, do I want to stay here or do I want to get myself into a more positive and healthy work environment? So, I think allowing authenticity can really help you understand other perspectives. So a couple books I'm going to throw your way. This is one of my favorite books in the whole world. One of my favorite authors, Paul Arden. Paul Arden wrote 3 books. God Explained in a Taxi Ride. Whatever you think the opposite here. And then it's not how good you are, it's how good you want to be. You can read these books in like 20 minutes. They're short, they're picture books. Paul Arden, before he passed away, was a retired advertising executive in London. And I just took a picture of one of my favorite pages here in one of my favorite books. The world is what you think of it. So think of it differently and your life will change. And his book is very simplistic, but again, you got to spend a lot of time like reflecting on his books and his sentences and the images that he used. And it's very true, though. The world is what you think of it. And what you think of it is based on your perception driven by your responses to emotion. So I did not have a good perception of the world, perspective of the world when my mom died, and just very like depressed, just woefully depressed. I went into Wegmans. My mom and I would go every Saturday. We'd have our routine for years. Go to Wegmans and then Chick-fil-A to see her friends. And after mom died, and I went to Chick-fil-A or Wegmans the one time, I literally had a panic attack in the bread aisle because I knew mom's order by heart, and eventually she got too weak, and I just did the run by myself. But I knew I probably still know her order by heart, and I had to call my sister because I was having a panic attack right in the Wegmans bread aisle, just kind of hid in the corner, hysterical crying, because I wasn't in a good place. I wasn't thinking that I could change my perspective. And I knew I realized that. It took me some time. It took me some time to realize it. Two other books that are pretty good: Choose Your Perspective by John Martin, Switch by Chip and Dan Heath. A little bit more academic in nature, research driven. Good books, good books. I would definitely start with Paul Arden, though. Just it's a fun book to read. And then just some, conclusions here. I want to give you a fable, and I'll open it up. I see there's some comments. I want to just conclude here with a fable of the farmer, the parable of the farmer who lost his horse, lessons on luck, non-judgment, and interconnectedness. And when I first stumbled upon this, I was like, oh, this really should go at the end of something. And it's the end of this webinar, obviously. Once upon a time, there was a Chinese farmer who lost a horse. All the neighbors came around that evening and said, that's too bad. And the farmer said, maybe. The next day, the horse came back and brought 7 wild horses with it. All the neighbors came around again and said, why, isn't that great? And he said, maybe. The next day, his son, who was attempting to tame one of these wild horses, was riding it, was thrown, and broke his leg. All of the neighbors came around in the evening and said, well, that's too bad, isn't it? And the farmer said, maybe. The next day, the conscription officers came around looking for people for the army, and they rejected his son because he had a broken leg. All the neighbors came around that evening and said, isn't that wonderful? And the farmer said, maybe. And we're back to where we started. Alan Watts's quote, the whole process of nature, of life, if you will, is one of immense complexity. It is impossible to tell if anything is good or bad, because you never know the consequences of bad fortune. Likewise, you never know the consequences of good fortune. And the farmer, when his son broke his leg, could have easily said, my goodness, this is the worst thing ever, right? And then the next day, the conscription officers come by and his son can't join the army, right? So if you've ever been laid off, I was laid off when my financial institution, the college that I was working with collapsed because of financial reasons. And I landed at Ocean County College for a year due to networking. And then that allowed me to spend a year looking for a job. And that's how I got to NJIT, a year and a half ago, almost 2 years now. And at the time I thought, oh boy, being laid off is the worst thing like ever. but it turns out to be one of the best things that's ever happened to me. I love my job. I love NJIT. I love what I do. I love my team. The Learning and Development Initiative, which I oversee, is just, you'll be hearing a lot more about it in the springtime. So at the time when I was laid off, yes, worst thing ever. But I allowed myself space to realize, oh, this might not be so bad in the long run. You can't see it in the moment. You can't see it in the moment. You're in too much pain. And I always tell people, look, have self-pity. You should engage in self-pity. But my prerequisite is give yourself a deadline. All right, for 6 hours, I'm going to feel sorry for myself. For 6 days, I'm going to feel sorry for myself. For 6 weeks, I'm going to feel sorry for myself. Whatever it is, write it down. And then on that day after the deadline, do the work to begin again. And if you can have that approach, then I think you can be a superstar. It takes a lot of self-awareness. It takes a lot of self-awareness, right? You keep asking yourself, is this good fortune or bad fortune? And you're really not sure, because the whole process of nature is one of immense complexity. This is my LinkedIn. Please link in with me if there's anything I can do to support you. You have my email. This presentation itself is available at tinyurl.com/NJIT1218. And I am more than happy to take some questions. I thank you for your attendance. I hope everyone has a wonderful holiday season. Happy New Year to everyone. And again, thank you if you've attended more than one of these. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And again, Kate, the campus's best friend and collaborator. Thank you, my dear friend. Thank you so much for your support.
Thank you. We have a few minutes left.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. Let me get rid of that.
Feel free to unmute, or you can write in the chat and I will gladly relay your message.
Oh, Stephanie, thanks for your comments here. The knowledge pie chart and your meatloaf story reminds me